Jack Caldwell was a very rich man who lived in a huge, cold mansion. His house was as fancy as it was empty, much like his life. He had all the money and power anyone could dream of, but he was missing one thing: a family. Jack couldn't have children, which left him feeling bitter and alone. He spent his days growing his empire and keeping people at a distance. Trusting others was something he had stopped doing long ago. One gray, chilly morning, Jack was getting ready to go to work. He wore a sleek, expensive suit, and on his wrist he wore a shiny watch that looked as valuable as a car. The watch wasn't just to tell the time, it was to show the world how important he was. But even with all his success, Jack felt hollow inside. His life was like his mansion, big, impressive, but cold and quiet. At the same time, Lila Harris was hurrying toward the Caldwell mansion. Lila was a housemaid who had only recently started working for Jack. She wasn't rich or powerful like him. Her life had been full of struggles, and she was trying to leave behind a difficult past. Wrapped in a coat to keep out the cold wind, Lila walked quickly, her eyes scanning her surroundings. She wanted to focus on her job, but the heavy feeling of her old life seemed to follow her wherever she went. As Lila got closer to the mansion, she noticed something strange. A man in a hooded jacket was standing near the iron gate. He wasn't moving, and something about him didn't feel right. Lila stopped for a moment, watching him. The man looked like trouble. Inside the gate, Jack was busy checking his phone as he walked out of his house. He didn't notice the hooded man waiting for him. Jack's morning routine was usually smooth and controlled, but today was going to be different. When Jack reached the bottom of the steps, the man suddenly stepped in front of him. "Give me your watch and wallet," the man barked, his voice sharp and angry. Jack froze. He had faced countless challenges in his business, but this was different. His hands shook as fear took over. The man's tone made it clear he wasn't joking. Lila had been watching from behind a low wall near the gate. Her heart raced as she realized what was happening. Every part of her wanted to run, to stay safe. But then she looked at Jack. He was standing there, helpless and scared. Something inside her wouldn't let her leave. She quickly grabbed a heavy rock lying on the ground. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the wall and shouted, "Hey, leave him alone." The hooded man turned to look at her, startled. This gave Jack a few precious seconds, but he was still too shocked to move. Lila, her hands trembling, raised the rock and threw it as hard as she could. It hit the man on the shoulder. He yelped in pain, stumbling back. Lila's shout and the blow from the rock were enough to make the man think twice. He looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Grumbling angrily, he turned and ran down the street, disappearing into the gray morning. When it was all over, Lila's legs felt like jelly. She dropped the rock and tried to steady her breathing. Jack, still in shock, slowly walked toward her. His face was pale, his usual confident expression replaced by disbelief. You saved me," he said softly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Lila looked at him, her own emotions swirling. "I just did what anyone would do," she replied, though her voice wavered. Jack shook his head. "No," he said firmly, "most people wouldn't." For a moment they stood there in silence. Jack, a man who always prided himself on being in control, felt something strange, a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. He didn't know how to deal with it. Finally he said, "Are you okay?" Lila nodded, even though her hands were still shaking. "Yes. And you?" "I'm fine," Jack said, though the tremble in his voice betrayed him. Without saying more, Jack turned and walked back into the house. Lila followed, still trying to process what had just happened. Inside the mansion, Jack sank into a leather armchair in his grand living room. He stared into the fireplace, watching the flames dance on the marble walls. For years, Jack had buried his emotions, focusing only on his business. But today, something had cracked that hard shell. He couldn't stop thinking about Lila. She had risked her life to save him, and he didn't know why. Most people would have run away. What kind of person does something like that? Later that evening, Jack wandered into the kitchen. He found Lila there, cooking dinner. She wasn't wearing her usual uniform, just a simple blouse and jeans that were still damp from the rain. Her hair was slightly wet and a few strands stuck to her neck. Her movements were calm and purposeful as she stirred a pot on the stove. For a moment, Jack just stood in the doorway, watching her. She seemed so different from anyone he had ever known. She wasn't loud or flashy, but there was something peaceful and strong about her. Seeing her like this brought back memories Jack hadn't thought about in years. He remembered his ex-wife, Clara, who used to cook for him when they were happy. Back then, his life had warmth and love. But everything changed when they found out Jack couldn't have children. Clara left, and Jack became the cold, distant man he was now. "Miss Harris," he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. Lila turned, surprised to see him there. "Yes, Victor Caldwell?" she asked. Jack hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I wanted to thank you again, for today." Lila looked away, stirring the pot again. "There's no need to thank me," she said. "Anyone would have done it." Jack shook his head. "No, they wouldn't." Lila was silent for a moment. Then she sighed. "I just did what felt right," she said quietly. Jack stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her. "You're different, Lila," he said, his voice soft but certain. Lila froze. She didn't know what to say to that. Jack continued, "I want to repay you for saving me." Lila turned to face him, her expression cautious. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I didn't help you because I wanted something in return." Jack frowned. "I know, but I need to do something. I have to." Before Lila could reply, a loud clap of thunder echoed outside. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the mansion into darkness. Lila gasped, her hands gripping the counter. Lightning flashed outside, lighting up the room for brief moments. Jack stayed calm, though he could see the fear in Lila's eyes. "Stay here," he said. "I'll check the generator." Lila nodded, though the darkness made her nervous. It reminded her of things she wanted to forget, memories she had been trying to leave behind. Jack left the kitchen, leaving Lila alone. She stood hugging herself as thunder rumbled loudly outside. She felt small and scared. When Jack came back from fixing the generator in the engine room, the lights in the big house were back on. But outside, the storm kept roaring like it was angry. The sound of Jack's shoes tapping on the shiny floor echoed as he walked back to the kitchen. He found Lila sitting at the table, her hands folded, staring at nothing. She looked delicate, like she might break, but there was something strong about her too. When she saw Jack, she looked up. His face was serious, but his voice was soft and kind. "The storm is getting worse," he said, nodding toward the window. "I think you should stay here until it's over. It's too dangerous to drive in this weather." Lila hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, thank you, Victor Caldwell." Jack walked closer, crossing his arms as he leaned against the counter. He looked at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "But there's something else I need to talk about," he said, pausing. "It's about the debt I owe you." Lila sighed, smiling a little but looking tired. "I told you, Victor Caldwell, I don't want anything." Jack frowned, looking more determined. "That's not good enough for me. I can't ignore what you did for me. I can't just go on with my life without doing something to thank you." Lila looked down, thinking. After a moment, she said, "If it's really that important to you, then there is something." Jack straightened, surprised. He thought she might ask for money or something fancy. "Of course. Tell me what it is." Lila took a deep breath, looking shy. "I'd like to take a cooking class, a Mexican one." Jack froze, blinking. "A cooking class?" He sounded confused. Lila nodded. "Yes. I know you like Mexican food, and I've always wanted to learn how to cook properly, especially dishes you might enjoy. I feel like I never do enough around here." Jack stared at her, stunned. "So after saving my life, the one thing you want is to cook better for me?" He sounded like he couldn't believe it. Lila blushed but looked him in the eye. Yes. Her answer was so simple and honest that Jack felt something strange in his chest. He cleared his throat. All right, find the best class, no matter where it is. I'll pay for everything. Lila's eyes widened. Oh no, that's not necessary. I just want something simple. Jack held up a hand to stop her. I said I'll handle it. Find the class and tell me the cost. Then he pulled out his wallet and wrote a check. He handed it to Lila. This is for anything else you might need. Travel, supplies, whatever. Lila looked at the check like it was a treasure. This is too much. I can't take this. Jack shook his head. Yes, you can. And you will. Lila finally took the check, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, Victor Caldwell. I can't thank you enough. You don't need to thank me, Jack said, waving his hand like it wasn't a big deal. You've already done more than enough for me. He paused. And when you've learned to cook Mexican food, I want to be the first to try it. Lila smiled shyly. I promise you will. Jack left the kitchen feeling a lot of emotions he didn't understand. Later, in his room, he stared at the rain falling outside. He kept thinking about Lila, about her choice to ask for something so small and selfless. It made him feel different, almost human again. Meanwhile, in her little room, Lila held the check tightly. She wasn't used to such kindness. But she knew one thing. Jack Caldwell wasn't as cold as he seemed. That very night, she decided to do something special. She would work hard in the cooking class and plan the perfect Mexican dinner for him. A few days later, Lila told Jack about the dinner she was preparing. To her surprise, he said something unexpected. I want you to eat with me, he said. Lila blinked, shocked. Me? Eat with you? Victor Caldwell? I don't think that's appropriate. Jack frowned. Why not? You're making the dinner. Why shouldn't you enjoy it too? Lila hesitated. I don't know how to act. I don't even know what to wear. Jack sighed, rubbing his forehead. When he spoke, his voice was softer. Lila, I'm not asking for anything fancy. Just have dinner with me. It'll be quiet, nothing big. Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't an order. It was a request. Finally, she nodded. All right, I'll think about it. For the next few days, Lila worked hard in the kitchen. She practiced recipes from her cooking class, tasting spices and balancing flavors. But every time she thought about having dinner with Jack, her heart raced. Why does he want this? She kept wondering. When the night of the dinner arrived, Lila stood in front of her mirror. She wore a simple blue dress that hugged her softly. Her hair was tied in a low bun. She felt nervous. Is this good enough? She asked herself. She almost changed into something plainer, but remembered Jack's words. He said there were no expectations. When Lila walked into the dining room, her footsteps were soft, but Jack heard them. He was already sitting at the table, wearing a white shirt and black pants. He looked both relaxed and sharp. When he looked up and saw Lila, he froze. Lila was beautiful, but not in a way that was flashy or planned. She had a natural beauty, like she didn't have to try hard to look amazing. She wore a simple dress that made her skin glow, and her eyes shone with a mix of shyness and determination. Jack started to say something but stopped, realizing it might sound strange. He cleared his throat and said more casually, Are you ready? Lila nervously nodded, looking away from him for a moment. Yes, I hope everything is okay, she said quietly. Jack smiled. I'm sure it will be, and pulled out a chair for her. Lila was surprised, but she smiled and sat down. The table was clean and pretty. Soft candles lit the dishes, making the food look even better. Lila had made tacos, enchiladas, spicy red sauce, guacamole, and a traditional dessert she had never made before. At first, the dinner felt a bit awkward. Jack asked her questions about the food, and Lila nervously answered, worried he might be judging her. But soon, they both started to feel more comfortable. This is really good, Jack said, trying one of the enchiladas, but it's spicier than I thought. Lila laughed softly. Oh no, I think I put too much spice in it. No, it's perfect, Jack said, smiling. Maybe I just need more water. They both laughed, and for the first time that evening, the atmosphere felt lighter and more relaxed. As they ate, every time their hands accidentally brushed against each other or when Jack handed her something, a warm feeling spread between them. It was a kind of energy they both noticed, but neither of them said anything about it. When dinner was over, Lila started to clear the plates, but Jack stopped her. "Leave that for tomorrow," he said gently. "But," Leela started to protest. "No, leave it," Jack said firmly but kindly. "Tonight is for you." Leela hesitated, but sat back down, feeling calm under Jack's gaze. "Thank you for tonight," Jack said. "It was one of the best dinners I've had." His words made Lila feel speechless. After they finished, Jack went to his room, but the dinner stayed in his mind. He kept thinking about Lila, her smile, the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her food. He couldn't stop thinking about her, and it made him uncomfortable. Why does she affect me so much? He wondered. He knew something was changing inside him, but he didn't want to admit it yet. Meanwhile, Leela sat on the edge of her bed, holding her hands tightly together as if to stop them from shaking. Could it be in my head, or did he really feel something? She thought. She laughed at herself. It's impossible. Jack Caldwell is a billionaire, and I'm just his maid. But deep down, she felt that something had changed. In the days after the dinner, things felt different. Jack tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting to Lila. He thought about the way she looked in the blue dress, how her eyes sparkled when she smiled, and the way her touch made his heart race. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the feeling grew stronger inside him. It was confusing, and he didn't know what to do about it. Lila, on the other hand, kept working as usual, but every time she saw Jack, her heart raced. It was like the air around him felt different. One day, when Jack was in his office working, he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, still looking at his papers. The door opened and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room. He looked up to see Lila standing there with a tray of coffee and cookies. "I thought you might like something to go with your work, Victor Caldwell," she said softly. Jack took the cup from her, their fingers brushing for a second. "Is this your idea?" he asked, looking at her closely. Lila smiled shyly. "I thought you might like it." Jack took a sip of the coffee and smiled. "It's perfect as always." Lila blushed, feeling something different in his tone. "I'm glad you like it," she said, trying to keep calm as she turned to leave. But just as she was about to go, Jack called her name. "Lila," he said. She stopped and turned back to face him. "You seem different lately," he said, his voice warm, more confident, maybe more radiant. Lila was surprised. "Different?" she asked, unsure what he meant. Jack nodded, his smile still there. "Yes, more radiant." Lila nervously laughed and looked away. "I think you're imagining things," she said. "Maybe I am," Jack replied, but he didn't look away. His smile made her heart race as she left the room quickly, pressing her hands to her chest. A few days later, Jack decided to take a break from work and walk through the garden. He didn't usually go there, but today he found himself standing near Lila, who was kneeling and working on a rose bush. He didn't know why, but he walked over to her. "Do you take care of the garden too?" he asked, watching her carefully. Lila looked up, surprised to see him. "When I have time, yes. I like doing it. It's relaxing." Jack bent down to look at one of the roses she had just trimmed. "It looks like hard work," he said, gently touching the soft petals, "but the results are beautiful." Lila smiled. "Sometimes the hardest things are the most worth it," she said, looking at him in a way that felt like there was more behind her words. Jack paused and met her gaze. The world seemed to go silent, and in that moment something between them shifted. Jack reached out and offered his hand to help her stand up. As their fingers touched, the same warm feeling rushed through both of them. Lila hesitated but took his hand. "I think I need your help with this," Jack said, holding her hand a little longer than usual. Lila smiled softly, trying to break the tension. I don't know if you're cut out for garden work. Jack raised an eyebrow, teasing her. Maybe I'll surprise you. Lila's face turned red again. She laughed, and for a moment, Jack looked at her lips, but he quickly looked away. Well, if you want to try, I'll be around, he said, smiling again. Lila felt her face warm as she returned to her work, and Jack couldn't stop looking at her. He knew he was getting too close to something dangerous, but for the first time in years, he didn't want to run away. That night, Jack lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't stop thinking about Lila, about her laughter, her smile, the way she talked about simple things. I can't feel this way about her, he thought. It's wrong. But deep inside, he knew he couldn't deny what he was feeling. Across the mansion, Lila sat on her bed, hugging her knees and looking out the window. The stars seemed brighter that night, but she couldn't focus on them because her heart was confused. Why does he look at me like that? She wondered. Why does he make me feel like there's something more between us? She shook her head, trying to convince herself that it couldn't be true. But deep down, she felt that something was about to change, and neither of them could stop it. That night, a storm raged outside, its sound like a restless symphony. The clock struck 10, and Lila finished cleaning the kitchen. The storm seemed to echo the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. Every time she saw Jack, it felt like something was happening between them, and she wasn't sure if it was real or just in her head. As she was putting away the last of the dishes, she heard footsteps. Jack appeared in the doorway, his serious gaze meeting hers. Are you finished for the day? He asked. Lila nodded, feeling nervous. Yes, Victor Caldwell, I was just about to go home. Jack looked out the window at the heavy rain. It's not safe for you to go out in this weather alone. I'll take you. Lila's eyes widened in surprise. You don't need to do that. I can take a cab. Jack shook his head. It's no trouble. Go get your things. Minutes later, they were in the car, the sound of the rain drowning out the silence between them. Every time Jack moved his hands on the steering wheel, Lila could feel the warmth. When they reached Lila's house, Jack parked in front and got out of the car, grabbing an umbrella. Lila opened the door, but before she could get out, Jack was already standing next to her, holding the umbrella to shield her from the rain. You didn't have to come out in the rain, Lila said quietly. I won't let you go in alone, Jack said simply. His words made Lila's heart race. There was something real in his concern, and it made her feel weak. Together, they walked to her door. The umbrella was too small to cover both of them, and a few drops of rain ran down Jack's face, making his strong features stand out even more. When they reached the porch, Lila turned to him, not knowing how to thank him. Thank you, Victor Caldwell, she said. Jack took a step closer, looking deeply into her eyes. Call me Jack, he said. Lila blinked, not sure what to say. His eyes seemed to show that he was letting go of everything that made him hard to understand. It's okay, Jack, Lila said quietly. He stepped closer, so close she could feel his warmth even though it was cold and rainy. Lila, he started, but then he seemed unsure of what to say next. She looked at him, her heart racing, and whispered, What's wrong? He didn't answer right away. Then he leaned in and kissed her. At first it was soft, like he was asking a question, but when Lila didn't pull away, the kiss grew stronger, full of feeling. The rain kept falling, but for a moment it felt like time had stopped. When they pulled away, they stood there in silence, so close that they could feel each other's breath. I shouldn't have done that, Jack finally said, looking away, his face showing regret and longing. Why not? Lila asked, confused. Jack didn't look at her. Because it shouldn't have happened, he said. Before she could reply, he turned and walked to his car, leaving Lila standing on the porch, feeling sad and confused. The next morning, Lila walked to the mansion, feeling nervous. When she got inside, she tried to avoid the kitchen because she didn't want to see Jack. But they ended up crossing paths in the hallway. He was coming out of his office, looking tired, but there was something else in his eyes. Good morning, Victor Caldwell, Lila said, trying to sound normal. Good morning, Lila, Jack replied. They stood there, the silence between them feeling heavy. Then Jack took a step closer. About yesterday, he started. I need to apologize. Lila's heart sank. Apologize? She asked. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. I lost control. It's been a long time since I've felt like this. Why is that bad? Lila asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack looked at her, fighting with himself. Because I can't. Not with you. Without saying anything more, he turned and walked away, leaving Lila standing in the hallway. Later that night, Jack sat in his office, surrounded by papers he needed to work on. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, his mind kept drifting to Lila. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the kiss they shared in the rain. He wished he could tell himself it wasn't important, but the feeling wouldn't go away. He stood up from his desk and walked toward the kitchen. He needed a break. When he got there, he saw Lila organizing the groceries. She was humming softly to herself, and the way she looked caught his breath. He stood in the doorway, watching her until she noticed him. Victor Caldwell, she said, surprised but polite. Do you need anything? Jack hesitated. He wanted to say no, that he was just there by chance, but instead he said, I couldn't sleep. Lila tilted her head, looking at him curiously. Maybe some tea will help? I can make something for you. No, Jack said quickly, stepping closer. That's not what I need. Lila frowned, wondering what he meant. What's going on, Jack? She asked in a soft voice. He took another step closer. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted. Lila felt her heart race. That doesn't make sense, she said. Maybe it doesn't, Jack replied, but his eyes were filled with truth. But it's how I feel. Lila looked into his eyes, searching for answers. Then Jack reached out and touched her face. Lila shivered, feeling the warmth of his touch. Jack, she whispered, but before she could say more, he kissed her again. This time it was different. The kiss was full of urgency, like they didn't have enough time. Jack's hands gently held her, pulling her closer, and Lila couldn't resist. She was tired of fighting the feelings she had for him. When they finally pulled away, they were both breathing hard. Jack looked at her, his eyes full of emotion. Come with me, he said in a low voice. Lila hesitated, but when she saw the sincerity in his eyes, she knew she couldn't say no. They walked up the stairs together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet house. When they reached Jack's room, he opened the door and let Lila go inside. The room was just like she imagined, elegant but simple, with dark wood furniture and soft moonlight shining through the window. Jack closed the door behind them and stood still for a moment, watching her like he was trying to remember every detail of her. I don't know how I ended up here, he said quietly, but I do know I don't want to be anywhere else. Lila's heart swelled, and she could hardly believe what he was saying. Before she could speak, Jack pulled her close and kissed her again. This kiss was full of passion and longing, and they both lost themselves in it. Later, after they lay down, the storm outside seemed to match the intensity of their feelings. Every touch, every look was full of emotions they couldn't deny. The next morning, as the sunlight started to shine through the window, Jack woke up early and watched Lila sleep. She looked peaceful, and he didn't want to disturb her. But deep down, he knew things couldn't stay like this. He couldn't keep pretending that Lila was just the maid and he was just her boss. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a familiar voice. Jack, where are you? It was Isabel, his ex-wife. Jack's mood changed in an instant. Isabel had entered the house like she still had the right to be there. He quickly left the room to make sure she didn't see Lila. When he reached the living room, Isabel was already there, dressed perfectly as usual. Her face showed she was upset. What are you doing here? Jack asked, his voice angry. I've come to get some things that are still mine, Isabel said, crossing her arms. I don't need your permission. This isn't your house anymore, Isabel, Jack replied. stepping closer. Isabel laughed coldly. Please, Jack, don't act like you have control over everything. You can't even start a family. Jack's face grew red with anger, but he didn't say anything. Just then, the door to Jack's room opened and Lila appeared. She had been fixing her hair and looked surprised to see Isabel. The room fell silent. Isabel looked at Lila and then at Jack, her smile turning mean. Oh, I see, Isabel said with a sneer. You're having an affair with the maid. Lila froze, embarrassed. This is none of your business, Jack said quickly, stepping in front of Lila to protect her. Isabel laughed again. Jack Caldwell, the rich billionaire, now sleeping with the maid. How pathetic. Lila lowered her head, feeling ashamed, but Jack stepped closer to Isabel, his eyes blazing. You've crossed the line. Don't come back here again. CLA smiled, feeling happy about the trouble she caused. Good luck trying to fix it, Jack. You'll need it, she said, and left, leaving the door open behind her. Lila quickly ran out of the mansion, feeling sad. CLA's words kept echoing in her head, and no matter how hard she tried to forget them, they stayed. Lila kept thinking, what could Jack want with someone like me? He's a billionaire. He comes from a world I don't understand. Maybe CLA is right. Maybe this was all a mistake. When Lila got home, she sat on the sofa, hugging her knees, and the tears started to fall. Jack walked around the mansion, feeling angry and sad. He knew CLA had been mean, but what bothered him most was how her words hurt Lila. He had to make it right. He needed to talk to her and show her that nothing CLA said mattered, but he was scared too. What if CLA was right? Jack sat down on the couch, his hands on his face. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he didn't know what to do. He realized he had to make a choice soon before it was too late. Days passed, and the mansion, once full of power and control, felt empty to Jack. Every room reminded him of Lila. He missed the sound of her laughter, the way her perfume smelled, and the way they looked at each other. Ever since Lila left without saying goodbye, Jack called her over and over again, but she never answered. He left short, nervous messages, trying not to sound desperate, but the truth was, he was heartbroken. Leela, please pick up. We need to talk. Each ignored call hurt him more. He had never felt this way before. His pride didn't matter anymore. Lila had broken through his walls, and now he didn't know how to live without her. Meanwhile, Lila was trying to stay away. She ignored the calls because she knew if she heard Jack's voice, she might give in. She didn't want to be hurt. I can't be with him. He's a rich, powerful man. It would never work. She was in love with him, but she was afraid he would only use her. And then there were CLA's cruel words, which she couldn't stop thinking about. But one day, Lila began feeling strange. At first, she felt dizzy, then sick, and couldn't eat. She thought it was stress, but then she realized her period was late, and she started to get worried. She took a test, and when 2 lines appeared, Lila couldn't believe it. She was pregnant. Sitting on her bed, Lila's heart raced. Tears streamed down her face as she thought, how is this possible? CLA said it couldn't be. But here it is, the truth. Lila held the test like it was precious, but also terrifying. How can Jack believe me? He's not sure about how he feels about me, and now this. For hours, Lila sat still, lost in her thoughts, until something inside her changed. She knew she had to tell Jack. He had a right to know. She couldn't keep hiding. At the same time, Jack sat in his room, staring at his phone. He had been waiting for Lila to contact him. He thought about going to her house, but didn't want to make things worse. Just then, a message popped up on his phone. It was from Lila. I need to talk to you. Can I come over tonight? Jack couldn't believe it. His heart skipped a beat. He quickly typed, sure, I'll be waiting. But inside, he felt both relieved and nervous. What did she mean? Why now? Later that evening, as the rain fell lightly, Lila arrived at the mansion. She stepped out of a cab holding a small umbrella that didn't keep her warm. Jack saw her and his heart raced. She looked pale and fragile, but she was still the woman he couldn't stop thinking about. Lila, he said, his voice full of emotion, I thought I'd never see you again. Lila looked away, trying not to cry. We need to talk. Jack nodded and stepped aside to let her in. They both walked to the living room, and the silence between them was heavy, like it filled the whole room. Jack gestured for her to sit down, but Lila stayed standing, her arms crossed as if trying to protect herself. What's going on? Jack asked, trying to hide his nerves. Why haven't you talked to me in so long? Lila took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew this conversation would change everything, but she couldn't wait any longer. Jack, she began, her voice shaking. I didn't know how to tell you this, but I'm pregnant. The room was completely silent. Jack stared at her, not sure what to say. Pregnant? He repeated, as if the words were hard to understand. Lila nodded, her hands shaking as she held onto her coat. Yes, but that doesn't make sense, Jack said, standing up and running his hands through his hair. You know I can't. He couldn't finish his sentence. CLA's words echoed in his mind, making him feel unsure. I know what you're thinking, Lila said, her voice trembling, that it can't be yours. But I haven't been with anyone else, Jack. Not since that night. Jack looked at her, trying to find doubt in her eyes, but all he saw was honesty. He felt like the ground was disappearing beneath him. Lila wiped her eyes, trying not to cry. I don't expect you to believe me now, but I had to tell you. I needed you to know the truth. She paused and pressed her hands together. I'm leaving now. Think about what you want. Before Jack could speak, Lila started to walk to the door. But as she reached it, Jack grabbed her arm. She turned around quickly, and there he was, Jack, standing with tears in his eyes, his face full of emotion. Don't go, he said, his voice low but full of feeling. Lila stopped, feeling confused and with tears in her eyes. Before she could say anything, Jack pulled her close and kissed her deeply. His kiss was full of love, thankfulness, and relief. When they broke the kiss, Jack held Lila's face gently, his thumbs softly moving across her skin. I love you, Lila, he said, his voice sounding a bit rough but full of certainty. I didn't know I could feel this way, but you've shown me it's possible. And now you've given me something I thought I could never have. Lila felt tears fall from her eyes, but this time they were tears of happiness and relief. I love you too, Jack, she said. But I was so scared, I didn't know how you'd feel. Jack smiled and shook his head. How could I feel any other way, Lila? All I've ever wanted was a family. You've given me that. You've given me everything. He hugged her tightly as if he never wanted to let go. We'll get through this together. I'll always be by your side. Lila hugged him back, feeling all her fear and doubt disappear. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. A few weeks later, Lila and Jack were at the doctor's office, waiting for their first ultrasound. Jack held Lila's hand tightly, his face showing how nervous he was. When the doctor walked in and started checking, the room was filled with the sound of a heartbeat. Here's the first little heart, the doctor said, smiling. Jack squeezed Lila's hand, his eyes full of excitement. First? Lila asked, feeling confused. The doctor moved the device on Lila's belly and laughed softly. Yes, first, because there are two more. Jack and Lila gasped together, both amazed. 3? They said at the same time, not quite believing it. The doctor smiled and nodded. Yes, triplets! Congratulations! Jack put his hands on his face, laughing with joy and disbelief. He looked at Lila, whose eyes were full of tears, but her smile was brighter than ever. It's a miracle, Lila whispered. Jack kissed her softly, holding her face again. It's more than a miracle, Lila. It's the most precious gift I've ever received. Months later, Jack and Lila got married in a small ceremony in the garden of the Coldwell mansion. The sun shined as if it was blessing their special day. Every detail of the wedding showed how much love they had for each other. I promise to love you forever, Lila said, holding Jack's hands as they exchanged vows. And I promise to give you all the love you deserve. You and our children are my whole life. When they said I do, The guests cheered, but for Jack and Lila, in that moment, it was just the two of them. Soon after, their triplets were born. 2 boys and a girl, all healthy and full of energy. Jack almost fainted when he saw them for the first time. They looked just like him. They look just like you, Lila said, laughing as she watched Jack hold all 3 babies in his arms. His smile was so big, it was like it would never go away. I don't know if I can do this, he joked, but his eyes showed how proud he was. But with you by my side, Lila, I think I can do anything. The years went by, and the Coldwell Mansion, once a lonely place, was now filled with laughter, love, and the sounds of children running through the halls. Jack was a wonderful father, Daft smiling at every word his children said. Lila, on the other hand, was the heart of the family, a loving mom and the light of Jack's life. The mansion, which used to be just a big house, was now a true home. For Jack and Lila, there was no greater treasure than the love they shared and the family they built together. They overcame every challenge, and fate brought them together in a way that gave them the happiest ending they could have ever imagined. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.